So this is von Neumann's advice to people who write code, which really hasn't changed in 56 years, which I think is still very true. That it's easier to, you guys do it, but it's easier to write code than understand something that somebody else did. So hopefully, I'm going to give you this very deep historical picture of how the world we're in got here at the beginning, but hopefully you get something from it that actually is useful. So I'm going to talk mainly about von Neumann, who really brought Turing's ideas into the commercial world. Turing was a logician who, at the time, was probably seen as like the least likely. If you took the various disciplines in the 1930s, logic looked like about the farthest removed from reality. Logicians were left very much to themselves, but in the end, it did have real effect. So if we go. I have all these documents chronologically organized. I can look, and so I could look this morning and see, well, what happened exactly 60 years ago on the 9th of April. This is the monthly report on von Neumann's computer project transcribed there. So for the very first time, they're actually taking a coded message that was coded on magnetic wire and reading it into the shift registers inside the computer they were trying to build, and then outputting it back out on the wire and actually getting the same message out that they put in. That was a tremendous breakthrough, and that happened exactly 60 years ago. So here's the typewritten coded input, and this was their wire drive. So this is the ancestor of your hard disk. This was a spool of electrical recording wire on two bicycle wheels that were differentially coupled. So it was, as you ran that half horsepower motor, it was unwinding from one spool and winding up on the other at a very high speed. You needed the high speed to get the high bit rate, and it would burn up the heads and stuff. And that's a picture with iron filings showing. So each of these is a bit, and here we have a oscillograph of that's a 40-bit word. The machine was 40 bits wide. It ran bit parallel structure, which was revolutionary at the time. So that's actually a 40-bit word. And getting useful computation out of that was a real stroke of engineering genius. So even when they were at that dismal stage of getting the hardware to work, von Neumann and Goldstein and others were already working on the codes that were going to run on this machine that they thought was going to be ready in 6 months, but it was actually more like 3 or 4 years still to actually get the thing running, but they were writing the code. So that's essentially the first software manual. And von Neumann's view, which he always credited directly to Turing. There was never any conflict at the time. That what von Neumann told the engineers who came to work for him is, we are going to build Turing's crazy logical machine. We're going to actually do it in hardware. So von Neumann, who lived 1903, so when von Neumann was my age, he had already been dead for 1 year. So he got an awful lot done in this short period of time. Starting out very young, had the good fortune to be born in Budapest and sort of go to school and grow up in Budapest between World War I and World War II. It was this incredibly fertile time that produced von Neumann, Eugene Wigner, Leo Szilard, Paul Erdős. A whole galaxy of people somehow came out of that world, and then fortunate enough, we gave them visas and they came to America. So this is young Johnny up there. You see where he's actually sitting on this giant cannon, a piece of artillery. He had a great fondness for weapons, and this stayed with him throughout his life. Here he is with John von Neumann and Wernher von Braun, so the rocket guy and the computer guy, who they all came to America. At age 12, he's already doing math. This is his cousin Lily. He's found that he has this gift for mathematics that was almost appalling. How many fields, about 6 major fields in mathematics that he revolutionized. This is his class at the Lutheran Gymnasium, which was sort of like the Bronx High School of Science, but squared. Just incredibly rich. and it's unclear. I've been part of various studies trying to figure out why things worked so well in Hungary at the time. And part of it was desperation. Part of it was the Hungarian language. Nobody else learns Hungarian. So if you're Hungarian, you have to learn some language that the rest of the world is ready to listen to. And that's, I think, why we have so many great Hungarian mathematicians, musicians, Hungarian cinematographers, filmmakers, all sort of had to find these universal languages by which they could survive in the larger world. And the culture, if you read the diaries of the people who grew up then, there were parties that went on 3 or 4 days. There were sort of mix of partying and drinking and intellectual conversation. There was sort of rich intellectual life and then teaching was really honored. I mean, the best teachers went to teach high school, actually, not university. So it was very rich. That's von Neumann and his family. But very hard to get jobs. So he immediately had to get a job, and he's working in Berlin and already publishing serious papers. And then in 1930, comes to America. He and Wigner are given, at that time, Princeton University had a quota against Jewish students very strictly and against Jewish professors not as strict. So they offered one professorship to Wigner and von Neumann that they shared. So they both got a telegram. They each thought that there had been a typographic error in the telegram with the salary they were offered. It was about 10 times what you got in Budapest. And then they compared notes and realized it wasn't a mistake. And came to the Princeton University. Then in 1930, the Bambergers, who were the equivalent of Jeff Bezos here in Seattle, sort of the merchant prince, decided to start this Institute for Advanced Study, where there would be no instructions as to what you're supposed to do. You just could work on whatever you felt like working on. And the premise was started, the money came from the Bambergers, and the idea came from Abraham Flexner, who believed in this usefulness of useless knowledge. And it worked very well. It produced a lot of useful ideas, and a lot of people wasted the rest of their lives there. They gave 2 classes of memberships. You either were invited for 1 year or you were invited for life. There was very little in between, and it still exists that way today. And so von Neumann gets an appointment there in 1933, which is impossible to resist versus going back to Hungary where things looked really bad. So the Institute was built, it was this very much like Google headquarters in Mountain View, just built to be everyone's dream come true. Free food, free places to live. Cafeteria was on the top floor. A very comfortable lounge in the bottom floor. It was home to, the first professor was Oswald Veblen, who was a very much applied mathematician and a pure mathematician. And then the second professor was Einstein, which gave them their reputation. So they're famous as the place where Einstein ended up. So if you go in the main entrance, you see Professor Veblen, next to him Professor Einstein, and von Neumann, who's right next to the common room because he's so social. So that's the first floor. On the second floor, who's above von Neumann is Kurt Gödel. And this is important because the computer project actually started in this room next to Gödel. And I think Gödel had an impact on the birth of computing we don't really recognize. That this whole idea that you could address 40-bit numbers, give them a 5-bit address, and then manipulate those 5-bit addresses, and you actually are manipulating 40-bit numbers. That was really what led to the explosion of computing. And that was really Gödel's idea, because that's how he proved his big theorem that revolutionized the world was by this idea that you could give concepts numerical addresses and then manipulate the concepts with arithmetic and then prove that true things would be unprovable. So there's Gödel, who was very close friends with Einstein, primarily because they both spoke German. And in Gödel's great paper of 1931, which was sort of the predecessor of what Turing did, he, of course, credits von Neumann. He'd been collaborating with von Neumann back in Europe. So all these ideas came sort of to America at the same time. The Institute saw its job very much of rescuing people from Europe. So here in 1939, they're trying to bring all the people out they can and paying very little. So Erdős now has this reputation of he's going around sort of begging for food and sleeping at people's houses, camping out. But he got $750 a year. Those are the yearly salaries. Kurt Gödel was $200 a month. So they maximized what they could with their very low budget to bring these people. So when von Neumann showed up with all this computing money from the Atomic Energy Commission and IBM, that was really something. It was like, again, like Google showing up and giving all you guys jobs. So von Neumann is there, and he immediately sees that this is a letter that's historically important, unknown to historians, but preceded the Manhattan Project, where he's saying that basically he's heard through the grapevine that the Germans are starting to work on nuclear fission for weapons. And this is a proposal. He and Oswald Veblen ran the ballistics program in World War I. They're proposing to the Rockefeller Foundation to start bringing European physicists out of Europe. The Manhattan Project had not started yet, and this was actually very important because it's one reason when the Manhattan Project did begin, we already had a lot of these physicists on our side. And von Neumann, he couldn't look at he just loved problems. If there was a practical problem, he would figure out some new kind of mathematics. So he looked at the problem of how you would create an atomic bomb, and the real problem was getting a high pressure. You needed to get an implosion of conventional explosives. And he figured the math out for that led to shaped charges and a bunch of other things, and led to the implosion weapons that all the nuclear weapons we use today are based on that design. This is the first one, the Trinity test in Alamogordo in 1945. And that sort of gave people who worked on that a lot of them were these pure mathematicians who sort of went bad during the war. Von Neumann, Richard Feynman, who never worked on weapons again, and Stan Ulam, who went on to do the key breakthrough on the hydrogen bomb. So suddenly these sort of people who've been working in pure, von Neumann started in the foundations of set theory and so on. Suddenly they're allowed to have machine shops and work with hundreds of people helping them and so on. It was very, very seductive. So after the war was over and the bombs had gone off, the question became, what was next? And for von Neumann, the answer was very clear, that the next big thing was going to be computers. But not only computers, it also was going to be more bombs. And so the real push to do this project, and where von Neumann got the money, was to design the next generation of weapons that was really a computational problem. All our cell phones now have more computing power than Los Alamos design, even when they designed our current stockpile weapons. So the big decision was not, dropping the bombs on Japan was a huge decision, but an even bigger one was this decision to go start testing in the Pacific. And that's really what pushed, of course, the Russians to keep up and started the whole Cold War race. We didn't need to do that, but we couldn't resist. And von Neumann couldn't resist. What would happen as a hydrodynamicist if you set off a 20 kiloton explosion underwater? That was so, couldn't resist doing that, and they did. And that's really how the explosion the people in England and elsewhere were also thinking about computers, but it was this American push through the weapons program that really led to the money and the resources to actually, so in that sense, von Neumann, ideas were not original to him, but he was the right guy in the right place in the right time to make it happen. The ideas had been sort of fermenting for centuries. This is Thomas Hobbes. This is the beginning of that Darwin Among Machines book, who really was the first in the English language to talk about what we now would call recursive functions, the idea that all the processes of logic and even thought can be reduced to simple addition and subtraction. Basically, if you can build an adding machine, you can do everything else. And you can get the other functions, and then as Gödel showed, if you have arithmetic, everything becomes possible. And also Hobbes thought about machines ultimately having a life of their own, which was what von Neumann was obsessed with toward the end of his life. And Leibniz, who was Hobbes's colleague on the continental European side, who worked deeply in binary arithmetic, showing how all the algorithms could be developed to do all this stuff with binary code. And in this manuscript, it was 1679, so a long time, almost 350 years ago, he proposes building a machine that the adding machines at the time worked with wheels and cranks. And he's talking about now a machine with using black and white marbles that run down tracks. And by shifting them, you can do all the functions of binary arithmetic. So what he's done is invented the shift register, which is essentially how all computers still work, except instead of marbles and gravity, it's electrons and a voltage gradient. But all the principles were there, and this is, of course, that's the quote that sparked Neil Stephenson to write his last trilogy that's sort of all based on the idea of what could have happened. So there's the shift register that von Neumann and his engineers designed. So it's exactly Leibniz's idea brought to life. And people at the time, they called these things mechanical brains. And now we think that's very silly. But it really wasn't that silly. And of course, in the context of the time, everyone was thinking that way. This is a proposal to the Air Force from RCA, for a memory system. And they're using the brain as their model. This is 100 years earlier. Alfred Smee, who did the first real work on neural networks and had all these crazy ideas about the electrical networks in the brain. He invented electrotype printing to make counterfeit-proof banknotes, a whole bunch of other crazy things. He also invented a method for sending facsimiles and actually compressing the images, very much like JPEGs, where you have a very small number of pixels convey more information. And he also explained, I think it's still the best explanation in print of, people write these long 600-page books about consciousness, and that's really it in 3 sentences. That if there's reality and there's thought, and if you can tell the difference, that's consciousness. And I think that's. And then this is, as far as I know, the first document that really describes a search engine. He describes this giant machine that would contain all concepts and be able to search out the points of contact, the differences. So it would be good for deciding, similarities and differences between religions and things like that. And then Nathaniel Hawthorne's quote at the time. So the idea was in the air that, that networks were going to take over the world. It just took another 150 years for you guys to really make it happen. And then the whole question of artificial intelligence, I think, was answered clearly in 1930 by Louis Fry Richardson, who here has a unstable, sort of quantumly unpredictable circuit here that he calls as a mind having a will, but capable of only 2 ideas. So there's no point at which artificial intelligence necessarily begins. It's like life. We may never find the exact origin of life. Just things slowly became more and more lifelike. And Louis Fry Richardson was actually very serious. This was not so serious, but he did the first work on numerical weather prediction in World War I, trying to he proposed dividing the whole world into a network of cells and then solving the differential equations between the cells. He estimated if you had 64,000 human computers working together, you could do this. You could actually keep up with the weather itself. So if you had 65,000, you could start to predict the weather. And his math was wrong, but the idea is actually how we do our numerical weather prediction today. And that obsessed von Neumann later. And H.G. Wells, with this book, should be the Bible of Google, is really explaining how we would be able to distribute all knowledge to make it accessible to everyone in the world. Got an incoming call. Oops. And keep it safe, which is the beauty of it. That if something exists on we're conferencing with our neighbors, and he makes the political point that this could be used, which is still the argument today. This could be used by dictators to control the world, but it would be more likely to be used by anti-dictators to keep the world free from dictators. So that really is where we are. And then Turing comes along and asks really as a mathematician, the question of can machines think? Can we actually deal with this in a mathematical way? And so he also had, like von Neumann, he had very short lives, 1912 to 1954, even less than von Neumann. He does a tremendous amount in that short time. He writes this paper in 1936 that seemed completely crazy at the time. It proposes this machine that has an infinite supply of tape and can do nothing but write and remember ones and zeros on this infinite tape. And in the end shows both the power of what you can do and what you can't do with that, with what we now call the Turing universal machine. And then, so what he proposes, looking at what Gödel had done, that if you could build these machines, you could take everything that people think is ingenuity, you could dissect it and replace, or what people think is intuition, you could replace with ingenuity. And that's essentially what computing is still doing, just replacing intuition. Every place you see some intuition, you can replace it with enough ingenuity. Now we have sort of unlimited ingenuity. At the time, of course, the war came along, and that's the same way that von Neumann suddenly could realize his dreams through the bomb project. Turing got to realize them through the cryptography problem, the problem that the Germans were sinking the U-boats by having better codes that we couldn't crack. So this was this machine called the Colossus, which is running these tapes, running the German signals on tapes and using very clever sort of Bayesian statistics to eliminate the probably wrong keys and overnight find the right keys. So Turing, the tragedy was that so much of what Turing did was kept secret. But after the war, so the same time as von Neumann's, this is 1948, the small group in Manchester starts building a von Neumann computer. They actually get the design and the sort of blueprints from von Neumann, but they build a smaller version and they get it in the British style. They get it done quicker. So they get this Manchester machine actually running in 1948. The present machine contains the minimum set of facilities for a universal machine. It only has 31 bits of memory, of core memory, but it still is. If you give it, half the time in the universe, it could do any. It's Turing complete. That's Turing with his first commercial machine. And the point he made that the important thing was being digital, more important than being electronic. So on the British side, the Turing tradition was thinking very hard about artificial intelligence and mechanizing thought processes. That didn't go anywhere so quick as on the American side, which again is not known to historians, but von Neumann already in May 1945 he was on retainer to IBM, and that's one reason that so much of these ideas became commercially so much successful in America was that in Britain they were still being kept secret. In America, IBM was starting to look at commercializing it. But even 1946, the maintenance manual for the ENIAC is still a restricted document. So the secrecy really hurt. Von Neumann gets the job of being assigned to build the next generation of the ENIAC, which is going to be called the EDVAC, and writes this report, which he was not the sole author of, but he got his name on the cover. Now we're go back. And good time for questions. There we go. Okay. Great. So, and immediately, one of the most important parts of the whole spectrum is the code. So he's really doing what Leibniz had done 300 years earlier, figuring out how you can build all these binary processes and things that we completely take for granted now. An adder is an adder. We don't think about how do you build an adder, but at that time, how do you actually design an adder out of vacuum tubes? There were a lot of different ways of doing it. And then what now we call the von Neumann architecture with a central arithmetic unit, now we would call the CPU, and the central control, the internal memory, the input-output, and the recording medium, which would be like the hard disk. And so all those elements were there, and we're sort of stuck with them ever since. And so he starts getting the money from the Army and the Navy and starts building this thing, but immediately is thinking of it as as an instrument, a scientific instrument that would not be, that he made very clear that he wanted to do this not in industry where it would be patented and protected and not in the government where it would be secret, but at the Institute where it would be open and copied all over the world. And that actually worked pretty well. So the first meeting was November 1945 in Vladimir Zworykin's office, the guy in the middle, who's the Russian guy who really brought television to America and now wanted to bring computing to America until RCA sort of got cold feet. So in this first meeting, they lay out the sort of 10 commandments, and these are the 3 important ones. The most important, that words coding the orders are handled in the memory just like numbers. And that really makes this big fundamental sort of breaking of symmetry like in physics, where up until that moment, we used numbers to represent things. Numbers would represent quantities or mean things, and then suddenly now we have numbers that actually can do things. Numbers are allowed to control the operation of the computer, and that's really why the whole world we ended up with. And that's the actual document where that idea first came up, that let a word, they didn't have bits yet, 40 binary digits be 2 orders. Each order is a command and an address. So it's the origin of the command line, that we actually would have an instruction and an address and then do that and then go on to the next step. That's really how it all started. And it started that Gödel had an office for a secretary, but he didn't want a secretary. It made him nervous having a secretary, so 211 was empty. So when they started out, the institute was very crowded. It was after the war. They couldn't build new buildings. But they said, well, you could use this little annex next to Gödel's office. So that's where the computing group started out and wrote these first reports. As I said earlier, I think probably getting some of their ideas by osmosis from Gödel. The budget very low. So the first 4 months, it's only $4,700, less than $5,000. And then the next month, you see the beginning of the end. It's the first $4 for electrical work. So it's finally now that, there was a school of pure mathematicians who really didn't want this to happen at the Institute. Things like an and or gate, all that has to be decided sort of and then cast in stone. And doing all this with vacuum tubes, which are not really very digital. Finding this sort of binary, coaxing vacuum tubes to behave in a binary way was not easy. And figuring out how to do the structure of shift registers and all this stuff. So the whole machine had 3,474 tubes. The ENIAC had 18,000. So it was compared to the ENIAC, it was a microprocessor. Fred, if you have time, please tighten all nuts. Everything done by hand. So for the Institute, it was a shock, where all this pure abstract thought, it wasn't just Einstein. There was Greek history and art history and so on. These were suddenly disturbed by guys walking around with soldering guns and so Julian Bigelow, who had worked for Norbert Wiener as his engineer in World War II, became the lead engineer. Hermann Goldstein came from the Army and managed the project. Robert Oppenheimer, who became director of the Institute, who had come from Los Alamos, and von Neumann. They were sort of the supervising group. And then all these young people came in and helped build the computer, and then went on and built, like this is Jerry Estrin over there with the bow tie, who then went to Israel and built the first computer in Israel, copied this. So von Neumann's idea that the thing would propagate throughout the world worked very well. And then a lot of women doing the programming and coding. So it was a very crazy, happy group of people in a very fertile environment. But nowhere for them to live. So here and nowhere to actually build the machine. Here the director is proposing that really the only place they could start building it is in the basement next to the men's lavatory. And that's where they started, which actually today now is the server room for the Institute. So it's still doing, except now there's astronomical amount more computing. And even here, he's one of the classical historians who's complaining that the engineers are moving into the basement. So they had a hard time. And mathematicians in our wing over my dead body. That's from the historian. So there was this, so these were the original computer geeks, and now the directors complaining to von Neumann that these guys are coming up and putting too much sugar in their tea. which was rationed at that time. It was still after the war, sugar was still rationed. And they should come up and have their tea under proper supervision. But the programmers got the revenge, because now, if you go to the Institute today, the only place that has 24-hour tea and coffee is Shimoni Hall, which was built by Charles Shimoni, the Microsoft programmer. So in the end, the historians were lost out. They never did. All this computing was done with this machine was done just by inputting by hand. But they envisioned a console to make the thing look sort of sexier. So this was their mock-up of a, but the Institute didn't support sort of carrying this forward any. But that was which has a binary keyboard where has a 40-bit keyboard, so you can program directly in binary code straight. There was no alphanumeric keyboard envisioned by these guys. So that they thought and wrote reports every step of the way, which Jack Good, he's the guy who brought Bayesian statistics he was Turing's statistical assistant. So a whole lot of the ideas that you use now in making search work and so on really were Jack Good's original ideas, and made this comment that they not only explained what they did, they explained why they did it. So all these reports were collected and distributed widely. And if you look on where did they go? Interlibrary alone, IBM, RCA, National Cash Register Company. So all the ideas that flowered into the commercial computing industry, most of them came from this project. And then things like the basic machine order codes, once they were developed, they were like our own genetic code. It sort of stays unchanged for billions of years, because you don't change these fundamental things that start at the bottom. And the machine itself was very beautiful. Bigelow, he was a real engineer. He flew his own airplane and worked on his own engines. And so the thing was built, it was essentially a V40 engine. And each of these cylinders is a cathode ray tube that has a 32 by 32 matrix of bits. So there's 40-bit words and 1,000 words, and so one bit of each word is in a different tube. So everything had to work perfectly or it didn't work. And then so it really was like a V40 engine with overhead valves, literally. There's a statistic. So it used 16 kilowatts, which was very little at the time, 24 microsecond memory access. So that was the first time we had a machine that had fully random access to the memory. You could take any address and get the data out at any time. Whereas the British machine was still serial. You had to wait for this loop to come through and grab the bit as it went by. The clock speed was variable. It varied between 2 kilocycles and 16. But you could actually slow it right down to manual, so you could go one click at a time. And you could see the bits. Every bit was visible. So if you were debugging, you could actually step through the calculation. And it was very clever. And the cooling system. So these tubes actually have, what happened was a situation now, there's solid state memory inside this laptop, and it's being displayed as pixels on the screen. In this first computer, the pixels actually were the memory. If you have an old television and you turn it off for about a second or two, they're static on the face of the glass. So they were using the surface of the tube. They had to figure out a way. Von Neumann's rule is you could only use off-the-shelf sort of war surplus parts. So these are standard war surplus oscilloscope tubes. And then they put a screen on the face and an amplifier with a 30,000 gain, 30,000-fold gain on the amplifier. And this was an idea that was sort of jointly developed between the British and the Americans during the war for storing radar images. So you have this matrix of spots, 32 by 32. So that's 1,000. That's 1K. And each spot is refreshed every, in milliseconds. But if you go back in microseconds, you can read whether a bit is dark or light. So it became a random access memory where the pixels actually were the memory. They were not the display of the memory. That's sort of a profound, the way things sometimes work in biology where things get completely switched in their use. So it took incredible clock cycles to get this to work, to keep this thing refreshed. It's sort of like storing information in between the refresh cycles on a television. But it was quite effective. But then the difference between a 1 and a 0, between a dash and a dot, is this very sloppy kind of difference, and things were always going wrong. So that's the first, as far as I know, the first bitmap display. We're actually displaying memory that's inside the memory of the computer. And so every tube had its own logbook documenting its problems and idiosyncrasies. And here, if they went bad, the first step was to take them out and tap them because maybe there was a piece of dust. And he's sitting on a bucket of tape, of coding tape. So von Neumann became very interested that this problem, that how can you get reliable computation using sloppy components? And if we had not got to transistors and so on, we would have gone much further with these ideas. What the world today is exactly the reverse, that now the hardware is essentially completely reliable. Billions of cycles, you have no failures. But the software is unreliable. But the problem is the same. And it was exactly, again, what you guys are doing is how do you get reliable systems using unreliable parts and people doing unreliable things. So von Neumann became fascinated by that as a whole sort of theoretical problem on its own. But in reality, the poor engineers, they had no time to think about it theoretically. They just had to get this machine to work because we were trying to design these bombs. So that's the first logbook, November 1951. They finally get the machine running. And I'll just show you some of the, I hope you guys keep logbooks like this too. So, they keep track of the good time and the bad time. 25 minutes bad time, 37 minutes of 25 minutes of machine error, 37 minutes of human error. So they're always trying to differentiate between the human error and the machine error. No use went home. Everything, of course, is in hexadecimal. Before closing down in disgust, burning the midnight oil. So they essentially, the bomb guys usually ran late at night, and they were doing meteorology. Some was as a smoke screen for the bomb work, but during the day they were doing meteorology. So he's looking in tube number 36, trying to understand what was going wrong. Here's a demonstration for Dr. von Neumann, so they're hoping that works. And these are all checksums. So every step of the way they did a checksum across the whole machine, and all calculations were duplicated. Everything was. They could have built two computers, but they just ran the same one twice. So you did every calculation, every step 2 times, and didn't move to the next step until you had the same answer twice. So here the memory has turned into garbage. They're not getting any, everything would just suddenly grind to a halt. Impossible to follow this damn thing. Where's the directory? So they're looking for the manual. We're doing a core dump, what we would call a core dump, yawn. Big trouble. Now they got a drum. They started putting some of the secondary memory on the drum. It abandoned the wire drive, and the drum was having a lot of trouble. Surface all scored right down to the prime coat. Looks like a Bain bearing let go. Telegram sent to ERA. Arithmetic, not input output. So now they're, everyone's always trying to blame the other guy. It's not our problem. It's arithmetic. False start, machine or human. MANIAC. That was it was a successor to the ENIAC, which was electronic numerical integrator and calculator. This was the mathematical and numerical integrator and calculator, known as MANIAC. They gave up the name. Code error, machine not guilty. So things are starting to change. Found trouble in code, I hope. Damn it, I can be just as stubborn as this thing. What's the use? Good night. Master control off, to hell with it, way off. So sometimes they would just shut down. And here, physical problems. Because Princeton's a very hot place. Yes?
Good question. So earlier, it said BD, you mentioned they didn't have the word dead.
Yeah.
And now I've noticed the word, well, clearly the word word has appeared.
Yeah.
You had in some early ones, but now I see the word code. Now, how do these words,
code
language evolve?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Starts calling this code.
Code was there right from the beginning. Von Neumann always called them codes. I don't think he invented it. I mean, it just came from I mean, code was but it became the common use. A bit is interesting because bit really has been nailed down. That was John Tukey. Finally got tired of saying binary digit and said, let's just call it bit. And that was apparently early 1946. And Word, I don't know who came up with Word, but Word, again, as soon as they decided to do this parallel architecture, they called it a word. In fact, they even called it, I don't think they called them words in the delay line memory. They didn't. Because the other form of memory was where you had a tank and you just recycled the thing through a tank. So, so this one, there's a tar-like substance on the cards, and then you realize it's the tar is from the roof. It's getting so hot in the computer room, the tar is melting out of the roof. And then here, a mouse climbed into the blower behind the regulator rack, set blower to vibrating. Result, no more mouse and a hell of a racket. And here lies mouse, born, died, 4:50 a.m., May 27th. So they were working late one night, 4:50 in the morning after a long night of bomb calculations, this mouse died. And then some joker has written, here lies Marston mouse. And if you're a mathematician, you know that the purest of the pure mathematicians there was Marston Morse, who was one of the people who objected. I mean, the truth is, he didn't object to the computing project. He thought it was a great project, but it should be done somewhere else. It didn't belong at the Institute. So that's a dig at Marston Morse. So high speed, which was 16 kilocycles, even 8 kilocycles was high speed. And there's low speed, 2 kilocycles. And so everything had to be duplicated. I've now duplicated both results. How will I know which is right, assuming one result is correct? If you've duplicated the wrong answer, this is now the third different output. I know when I'm licked. So, and then now we're getting into 1958, right? The whole project is about to be shut down. Von Neumann is already dead. And now things have really changed. All troubles were code troubles. They've got the machine running smoothly, and they're sort of coming into the world we're in now, where really the problems are mainly software, not hardware. They haven't invented drivers yet, and then sometimes just perfect running. And then they weren't supposed to reveal that they were actually working on bombs, but here the engineers put back over to blast wave in the logbook. So the results were, fantastic. With the calculations they did on this machine, we got the first hydrogen bomb. Ivy Mike was a huge success. The second one was 15, was actually ran away. It was 3 times the yield it was supposed to. So these little numbers in the computer that suddenly were having real major effects on the real world. The strange thing, like Turing in the war, that it was a tragedy in a way that things had to be kept secret. So Oppenheimer, who got in so much trouble and really lost his job because he was seen as having opposed the hydrogen bomb. Actually, they were essentially building it right there under his command, but he couldn't talk about it. So things were really looking bad. That's from some of von Neumann's private letters to his wife. And they're saying that he thinks the next war is between 2 years and 10 years away. And it's definitely going to be nuclear, and it's probably going to involve hydrogen bombs. So he was actually seriously pushing that we should attack the Soviet Union before they grew strong enough to attack us, which again seems crazy now, but in his rational way, as a game theorist, it was the thing to do. So here we can see at the very dawn of this computing project, Stan and Nick, that's Stan Frankel, can now say they're openly coming from Los Alamos instead of just they were coming under assumed names and renting apartments and so on. And again, von Neumann looks at the problem and with Ulam's help invents this a whole new form of mathematics, which we call the Monte Carlo method, ideally suited to computers. So here they're running the first Monte Carlo problems, but they're running them on the ENIAC. This is 1947. So the Princeton machine was nowhere near ready, but they've invented all this coding. So what they do is they figure out, hey, we could actually run these programs on the ENIAC. We can kind of retrofit the ENIAC, use these numerical registers which were built for storing ballistic constants and actually put very short programs in them. So here, Clary von Neumann, his wife, is explaining there's a new method based on a vocabulary, i.e. a set of orders, which is conveyed to the machine on two levels, the background coding and the problem coding. And that's the great sort of the origins of the operating system, the fact that you'd have one level of coding to set the machine up and then run your programs. And this sort of answers a huge historical debate, which was whether the von Neumann was first or whether the ENIAC was first at actually running stored programs. And the truth is in between, and it makes a lot of sense, that they actually invented this for the von Neumann machine, but then they figured out later they could get it to run on the ENIAC. So in the classical genealogy of computing, the ENIAC is right at the bottom, the IAS machine is up there. And what I've done as a historian is somewhat show how the influences actually went the other way, and the IAS machine actually influenced the ENIAC. That's Clary von Neumann's second wife, who he married in 1937. And all I managed to find, it's like finding somebody's dead disk drive, all the private letters between the two of them for 20 years, from 1937 to 57. So it gives a real a first-hand picture of what happened during that time. They were driving across, no air conditioning, no seat belts, no iPods or nothing, just AM radio and leaded gasoline. 28 times. So a lot of time to think and write handwritten letters. So Clary, he taught, on these long drives, he taught Clary how to program. So she actually, all these early Monte Carlo programs, she did. And here in her, she kept a journal. She's explaining how, he needed a guinea pig to teach programming to, and there she was. So he taught it to her. And she loved it. She became sort of the first, there you see the word coder. She became one of the first coders, an occupation which is widespread today. So to have the first-hand record of the very early programming here, that's a program for one of these H-bomb problems. And all these letters back and forth, which is the handwriting is fantastic. It just brings it to life in a way you don't get with email. And the conventional view is that the women who did these programming, that all they understood was the arithmetic. They weren't supposed to know they were working on bombs. In fact, they didn't know what they were working on. They just did the but it's really not true. If you read her journals, there's this one letter. It's clear she understands the physics of what's happening. They're doing a neutron diffusion problem for a hydrogen bomb calculation in 1949, which didn't work, but they're trying to see. So these are long calculations. The calculation might take, in this case, 6 weeks on the ENIAC, and you're getting a 1-bit answer. You're getting a yes/no answer. Does it explode or fizzle out? So along the way, she's watching the calculation and writing back, saying, well, I think we should change the tamper. It's starting to fizzle out, which clearly shows she wasn't supposed to, but she did know what the physics was about. And here, von Neumann gives an explanation. Why did he take all this money? It was sort of a deal with the devil. The AEC sort of said, well, you can have the computers, but we get the bombs. But if the AEC if the military got the bombs, then the scientists could do whatever they wanted with the computers. And that's so here he's talking to Edward Teller, really, how the factor 4, which is showing that the hydrogen bomb might work, is a gift of God or a gift of the devil. And so that deal was made, sort of Oppenheimer made that deal too, that if he would give the government the bomb, then the government would let the people at Los Alamos do whatever they wanted otherwise in science. And they did, and that changed the world. A whole lot of what revolutionized genetics and everything else came out of work that was done at Los Alamos, and that's sadly missing now. Now it's sort of been closed down, and there's not so much real science. So von Neumann what he wanted to do was biology. He figured out with the hydrogen bomb that was a way of completely destroying life. The next problem was, how about creating life? And he worked on that too, which again was unknown. He didn't publish it while he was alive because it was so far out and weird and would have scared people that they're looking at ways as what we now would call artificial life. He brought in Niels Barricelli, the crazy Italian-Norwegian mathematical biologist, who looked at whether we could start an evolution process inside this little 5 kilobyte memory of the computing machine, and the first person to talk about seeing it as an artificially created universe. And of course, doing it all directly in binary and allowing these numbers to evolve. The same stuff that Wolfram reinvented without any credit to Barricelli. And dealing with the real problems, something's wrong with the air conditioner, the smell of burning V-belts is in the air. Barricelli claims machine is wrong, code is right. So he built this cyclic universe because it could, there's only 5,000 bits. Let it run over and over and over again, watching and he's acted sort of like a field biologist, going in afterwards and seeing signs of parasites and things like that, and had a sense of humor about it, that this was it real life or not? Who could tell? And warned people he wasn't trying to create life. He was just observing what was happening in these self-reproducing numbers. But he saw all sorts of things that, like in biology, parasites and symbiosis. Here's the first of, viruses. A program is starting to take advantage of cycles that the other program is using. And then he started realizing he needed diversity, so he built different universes and allow things to migrate back and forth between 3 universes. It's only running like 5,000 generations, but the problem was that these things just stayed numbers. They didn't become anything else. So he saw that you needed the equivalent of, in biology, we have nucleic acids, but they code for proteins, and the proteins go out and do something. So you need to allow these patterns in the computer to go out and do something in the real world, which is what happened in the real world of computing. Suddenly we had programs that evolved and did start doing things and competing with each other. But he was seeing all this, at a time when there weren't even operating systems. This is the mid-1950s. But it saw it in a very biological way, that these early codes would be like what we now see as sort of the RNA world in biology, where you didn't yet have proteins, yet you had self-reproduction. And this, what he's talking about here, is very much like languages like Java and so on that will go out and actually recreate themselves on a remote host and act. And now we do, all the things that Barricelli sort of dreamed of are actually now part of the real computational ecology. And what he wanted was to learn. He was interested in the question of how did our real genetic code evolve, and he's had an insight. I think it was a good one. A lot of ideas were crazy, but this one was a good one. That these nucleotides were actually going out and collecting amino acids and bringing them back to a nest, sort of like social insects, and then slowly growing more and more complex until we ended up with the genetic system we have today. And so, he's wondering, if you let a process like this just keep running in the world of computers, where would it end up? And now we actually, in the real world now, we do have computer programs that code for proteins. And so, like von Neumann, Barricelli died before he could really see this come to life. When I went digging around in Princeton trying to find relics of these projects, there were 7 boxes in this basement that were supposed to have been thrown away. And in the bottom of one box was another box that actually had one of Barricelli's universes. The whole thing just fossilized, all the cards and the source code and everything else. And you could actually let it run and bring back to life. There's a note from to the engineer, and then a note back from the engineer, Mr. Barricelli, there must be something about this code that you haven't explained yet. And that's still the way it is today. We really, and Gödel really proved that you can have a code, within formal systems, you can always make formalizations that lead to things you cannot prove or understand. And von Neumann was fascinated by that. That's the book he was working on when he died that never got finished after he died. He was trying to collaborate with Stan Ulam, but Ulam was just so lazy he never wrote anything up. But in their letters, their notes for the book, you can see the chapters. So chapter 1 is Wiener, which was cybernetics. And chapter 3 is Turing, exclamation mark. Chapter 5, not Turing, the things that are not Turing computable. Chapter 13 is Ulam, and what was that? I think this is what it was. This was the idea that Ulam and von Neumann were kicking around in 1952 for what if you had a real digital universe like we have today, just sort of an endless matrix of bits, and you allow Turing-complete organisms to evolve and start competing with each other, which is essentially what's happening today in the real world. And then what happens? And do they start evolving, and do you have the equivalence of our biological cells, and can you end up eventually with metazoan digital organisms? And in a way, I think we have. That's what's going on the web. Then he also wrote, this book was published after he died, probably the most misunderstood title, because he's not talking about why the brain is like a computer. He's talking about why the brain, computing in the brain and computing in computers is completely different. And computing in the brain is statistical. It's not digital computing. It's analog computing, but it has a statistical element where the frequencies of pulses are counted. It's like PageRank for neurons, where if a neuron has a high PageRank, it connects to more things. So this idea that the language of the brain is pulse frequency coding and it's a statistical language. It's not a digital code. And I think that's very profound, and that's I think what you guys are doing in the world of computing is that we're building sort of more of an analog statistical system on top of the digital substrate. And that's where the very interesting things are happening. And you have template-based addressing. You're no longer restricted to this von Neumann numerical matrix. And Ulam's sort of always able to sum everything up in one sentence. What makes you so sure that mathematical logic, is the way we think? So Julian Bigelow, who was von Neumann's just brilliant engineer, never got enough credit, died in 2003. He wanted to build all different kinds of computers. They just had to get this one done to design those bombs. He had no idea that we would be stuck with this for 60 years. So he saw all these different ways of doing it. That you didn't need to have strictly sequential coding and so on. You could do completely different forms of computation, and that this whole numerical addressing was a very restricting limit, and there were other things would happen. And I think he eventually will be proved correct. That you're really stuck by having to just constantly juggle these sequences of addresses, and you could allow things. Computers now, this computer 99.9% of the time is waiting for the next instruction, and it's not getting any. There's no reason computers couldn't actually be computing without human instructions. And then another insight that they eat up instructions so fast. The only way that humans are able to generate enough instructions are through these recursive processes, but that actually there could be completely different kinds of programming. And von Neumann was thinking about that too. This is 1949. So we're really living in the world that he imagined. And Julian's comment, always wants to know, when you talk to these old timers, what were they thinking at the time? They knew that this was going to completely change the world. That's why they worked so hard. That's why they gave up all these engineers signed away their patent rights. They could have become millionaires, but they wanted to get this out in the world, and they knew it would change everything. And so the sort of end message is they weren't all von Neumann's ideas, so lots of other people's ideas, but he's the guy like the orchestra conductor who sort of could put it all together. And he wanted to then go on and revolutionize all the other fields like biology. Here, now the Institute is saying, what should we do with this computer lab? The School of Mathematics is divided into 3 groups, one consisting of pure math, one consisting of theoretical physicists, and one consisting of Professor von Neumann. They didn't know what to do with him. So they sent this out to these illustrious advisors, and this is the kind of answer they got back. So, but he did want a revolution. He wanted to use the computer to revolutionize it. So he made a deal, which tragically he died first, but he was going to become professor at large at University of California, and UCLA was going to give him a complete laboratory. He was going to bring out the meteorologists, the engineers, the biologists. They were going to do all, science would have been probably 10 or 20 years ahead of what really happened, because he wanted to do all that right then in 1955. First, he went to become head of the atomic energy. He was seduced by power and politics, was the other tragedy. But then on the other hand, it meant that the generals and the president listened to von Neumann in a way that, our president doesn't listen to many computer scientists now. So he got the medal from Eisenhower, but already he's in a wheelchair. And then he ends up in Walter Reed Hospital, where these notes were taken by somebody he was just constantly wanted stimulation. So someone who spent time with him left this, I don't know who it was, left this note where von Neumann, he was no longer remembering from day to day what he had said the day before. So he wants this machine that essentially was like a laptop, where he could, or like PowerPoint, where he could project books on a surface and make notes with a luminous pointer in different colors, with a method of erasure. So we live in that world that he dreamed of. It was possible, but he wanted to be able to think without physical interference, and we really get to do that now. And February 8th, October 57, he dies of cancer, probably from breathing a speck of plutonium or something. And the machine finally gets turned off. So midnight, July 15th, 1958, Julian H. Bigelow off, 12 midnight, the machine was shut down. But by then it had completely come to life everywhere else. And, IBM was building copies. Ulam had the last word. He died prematurely. He saw the promised land, but he didn't get to live in it. But what he imagined really was the dreams of Leibniz and Hobbes and everybody else brought to life. That this digital world would really become a world unto itself that was as rich as the real world itself. And that's where Turing's Cathedral comes from. Turing had this idea that when we built these intelligent machines, we weren't creating souls, we were building mansions for the souls which God creates. And I think that's really what all the people in this business are doing now. You really, the days of sort of the grand architects are over. It's now the people working on one brick at a time, this great cathedral that Turing imagined. So keep up all your good and interesting work, and what's amazing is that you don't have to live 50 years any longer to see all this happen. I mean, when I wrote that Darwin book, that was 10 years ago, and Google didn't really. I mean, Alta Vista was the search engine. So things are happening fast. Thank you.
I feel like you should ask us questions.
Yeah, I want to ask what you're working on.
Except that one.
All right. Anyway, but no, it is. I mean, my sister's involved in the 23andMe genetics project, which also is just beyond comprehension that we now have a consumer. I mean, you pay a ridiculous price now, but that you really get a fraction of a sequence for.
Do you see computers having consciousness at some point?
I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's not really the point. It's not going to be human. I completely disagree with people like Ray Kurzweil, who want to set this benchmark that, when the computer understands a joke, it will be conscious, and that's going to happen in 5 years, and then 5 years later it's something else. I mean, consciousness is so driven by culture. I mean, we're conscious because we're part of 6 billion people who have evolved consciousness as a society. And so consciousness among computers would be something incomprehensibly different. So if you use Smee's definition of that there's thinking, there's thought, and there's reality, and consciousness being able to tell the difference, we're heading that way. And again, what you guys are doing is, if you look at Google as a whole, I mean, I think the brilliant thing is trying to keep the processors actually working 99% of the time instead of waiting. I mean, what your Google machines are doing is all the time when someone isn't searching something, those machines are optimizing themselves and in their own way thinking about and moving data around and stuff and doing things. And that's not reality. That's something else. And yes.
To what degree do you buy into Kurzweil's concept and timeline for the singularity?
Well, the best answer to that, I was at a conference with him, and he gave his speech, this is, again, about 10 years ago. He gave his speech about we needed, I think it was 100 billion transistors, and that he showed his graphs of when we're going to have 100 billion transistors, and at that point, it's going to be a singularity. And then this little Hungarian voice got up in the back of the room. It was Charles Simoni, who's quite short, and politely said, when you have your 100 billion transistors, we're going to use 50 billion for the operating system. And that's the humorous answer, but you can't. Maybe there will be Kurzweil's singularity, but the person who articulated that a lot better was Jack Good, who worked with Turing. He wrote some fantastic papers. One of them is the ultra-intelligent machine, where he very clearly looks at that whole problem of machines that are more intelligent than their creators. But I think it's all going to evolve very differently. I don't think Kurzweil's dream of this sort of desktop machine that becomes intelligent I just don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I guess if I was going to bet, I would bet no. But I would bet yes that something else is going to happen that we're going to be probably quite unawares of. There was I went to a recent von Neumann conference in Princeton that had a game theory element. And one of the game theorists from Scotland gave a talk on if God exists, would God reveal herself? And the answer was no, that if by any payoff metric you have, the payoff will be higher if God does not reveal its existence. And that's probably true of artificial intelligence as well. That if there was real AI, it would be opaque to us. So we may continue to have conferences discussing it, and it might actually be happening. And that's not science fiction. I think that's just you can make that argument from a game theory point of view that the payoff is higher by.
I wonder if we're going to finally get to some progress on these kinds of fundamental philosophical questions in the next couple decades.
Yeah, I don't know.
If we do replicate consciousness in some appreciable form.
Yeah, if we replicating it, there's sort of this paradox that if it's complicated enough to be intelligent, it's too complicated to understand, and if it's simple enough to be understandable, it's not complicated enough to be intelligent. So as soon as we understand, we used to say, oh, if we had machine translation, that would be intelligent, and now we have machine translation. Well, we understand that. That's not intelligent. So we always move the goalpost to something else, to the things that we don't understand. And it's got to be music or art or these things. So I think the goalposts will just keep moving. And why do we want human intelligence anyway? I mean, there's obviously all kinds of other intelligence in the universe, but that's I'm not a philosopher, but I think the philosophers are not going to go out of business. They're going to have lots to philosophize about. Right. Great. Thank you. Get back to work.